This episode of UK Low Carb Podcast is sponsored by Deliciously Guilt-Free. Enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to UK Low Carb, the podcast where we share N=1 individual stories to help build the low carb and keto community, not just here in the UK, but also around the world. I'm your host, Dan Grief, and I think that change comes from grassroots movements and that we are the change we want to see in the world. And today is a particularly special episode because this is episode 100. Woohoo! So I can't quite believe we managed to get here already. I remember sort of being told by somebody, try and do your first 8 episodes and just keep going because that's the hardest bit. And I think once it becomes a habit, you get into it, just like low carb and keto. And to sort of celebrate such a momentous sort of episode, I thought I'd invite somebody really special on, and that is Gary Fettke. So Dr. Gary Fettke, welcome to UK Low Carb.
Hi, Dan. Great to meet you, and or face-to-face rather than on Twitter on the back end. But a pleasure and an absolute honour to be there for your 100th episode, which is a century, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a century, which is something you don't get in cricket, but we agree not to talk about that.
and your email and every comment so far is don't mention the recent Ashes, but, you know, by definition, you'd be glad to hear there was one Englishman, Johnny Bairstow, who did get a century here in Australia for the Ashes series, but and the total scores didn't often get a lot past a century, but
it's like Dunkirk, you know, we just take whatever we can as a victory, you know, like that was a big success in the Second World War. The Ashes, we got a century. That's the story. Let's move on.
That's the story. Okay. Oh, well, if you want to move on from there, we're quite happy to stick on this one for a little while.
Now, you've got, and you just say before the recording, you have a connection to Australian cricket, which I thought was quite exciting to share.
Oh,
So
we've got a few, actually. If we talk about Ashes, I mean, and low carb, then I can remember Australia losing the Ashes 5-0 in the UK. So that's a good thing. Good story.
Was that 2005? Was that when that was?
No. It was, maybe it was 4-1 or something like that, but it was about 2016, something like that. I can be corrected. I'm not great on history with dates.
That one, yeah. Because the first time we won it was 2005, I think, after like 16 years of never winning it. And then we did okay, fair enough.
Forget the dates, but essentially Australia were trumped in the UK. And then the following summer here in Australia won that, trumped the British. And really what happened in that time frame, Peter Bruckner was the team doctor, and he got most of the team to actually convert to low carb. And they got leaner and meaner, and some attitudes got improved and some got a bit worse and whatever, but effectively it changed. And I can remember texting Peter Bruckner in the Melbourne test and saying, please tell me that Mitch Stark has actually just gone low carb keto because he got 8 for it or something like that. And so literally the Australian cricket team improved their results dramatically with an improvement in their health, their well-being, low carb keto.
Amazing.
Around at the same time, the New Zealanders won the World Cup. And a little known fact is virtually the entire team was running low carb keto as well. And
I've never been more annoyed by keto and low carb in my life. This is terrible news.
And the All Blacks winning the rugby, most of them have been running low carb keto as well. So it's a hot topic in endurance sport, but becoming an increasingly aware topic which is being explored by leading sports teams.
Interesting you say that because, okay, so I've got a bit of a background in politics here in the UK, and I know MPs in Parliament who are doing low carb and keto, and when I say to them, well, tell the world about this, they tend to be a little bit on the back foot about it, like, well, that's for me, and I don't like to talk about my choices because they're scared, I think, that something could happen to them, and they might have a good reason for that. And I'm sure you could explore some of your experiences.
I've got no problem. 10 years ago, I had a direct discussion with the Minister of Health here in Tasmania. And I said, we've got to talk about reducing sugar intake. And he said, oh, no, myself and my family, we've all cut our sugar way back. And I said, well, if it's good enough for you, it's good enough for the people.
Yeah,
and
precisely.
That was that was part of my story, that I ended up having an enormous amount of blue with the system because I was advocating reducing sugar when it wasn't trendy to be talking about sugar and low carb and fact, it didn't even know, people didn't even know the term keto didn't even exist 10 years ago. And it's quite interesting to seriously look about how short that time frame is. And I've got a website, nofructose.com, that a pretty well definitive description of fructose metabolism, which is half of sugar, half glucose, half fructose, was only in 2010.
Really? That
I
late?
looked happy,
Wow.
yeah. So it's Journal of Physiology. I've flown to a meeting just so I could actually ask Luke Tappy one question. He's the world expert on fructose and sugar as a biochemical one. It was actually a Coca-Cola meeting. It was hosted in Sydney. And Luke Tappy had been brought out from Switzerland to actually speak in both Singapore and in Sydney to the masses, which meant effectively the food industry, which was actually a Coca-Cola meeting, that sugar per se was not the cause of obesity, which is fine. And I don't disagree with it. It's a multifactorial. But he was brought out to specifically talk about that sugar was not actually the cause of obesity. And he gave three or four talks in that day session that I was there, talking about the biochemical problems and the metabolism of fructose and the problems it has at a renal level, at a blood pressure level, at a kidney level, at a liver level, and a circulation level. And so his talks actually were all about the problems of fructose. But he was brought out to say that fructose by itself, and sugar by itself, is not the cause of obesity. So I flew all the way to Sydney to ask him one question. I forewarned him at lunch that I was going to ask him the question publicly. And I knew the answer to it, but I wanted to ask Luke Tappy. I said, is there a biochemical requirement for us to eat fructose? And the answer is no. Okay, but we don't actually need fructose to survive.
Yeah.
And I did a paper, there's a talk of mine on YouTube from late last year called Carbohydrate is the Dose is the Poison, where I made an argument because it was interesting to look at, okay, if we actually think that carbs are bad for us, and we're talking essentially about glucose predominantly, also fructose, but predominantly glucose, at what dose is it actually dangerous for us? So, if it's toxic, it's actually at what point does our intake of glucose have a negative effect on the body? It's really interesting. I made the argument that it's actually 4 grams, 1 teaspoon.
Wow, that's
so
small.
1 teaspoon of glucose biochemically has a negative effect on our bodies. And it has it multiple layers. It has it within the bloodstream on the glycocalyx, which is the lining of the bloodstream, blood vessels. It has it on insulin. And a lot of your listeners will have heard about insulin and its effect over a long period of time. So if you don't actually eat glucose, you actually don't have an insulin secretion, or you have a very, very low one with proteins. But effectively, you don't get an insulin spike. So I made an argument. What was interesting, the first time I gave that talk was to 350 doctors about, here's my argument that 1 teaspoon of glucose actually has a negative effect on the body. And no one argued with me. So either they weren't thinking or my argument was sound, but it's not that long a talk, but essentially I raced through the biochemistry. And one of the things I try and do in my talks is actually put it into terms which the layperson can understand. Use lots of pictures and try and work down that pathway.
Which, by the way, can I say is so important, because most of us aren't doctors or medics in the world, and we need to know that for our own health and for our children, and to raise our families. And I think that's really important. It's accessible to all of us. I think that's really good you do it that way.
Oh, look, but I don't have a lot of time for the health system as it is. I call it a sickness industry rather than the health system.
Yeah.
Most doctors forget biochemistry after first year medicine. It doesn't have any relevance. So after first year medicine, our understanding of biochemistry pretty well comes from the pharmaceutical industry. And that's all I've ever done, is I've just gone back to basic biochemistry and the new biochemistry that wasn't in my textbooks, and found out actually this is the metabolism of glucose, this is the metabolism of fructose, this is the contamination with polyunsaturated oils.
Yeah. So can I just ask you then about your own story for a moment? Because some people will know your story very well. Other people might be coming across your story for the first time. And I'm just going to ask with a particular focus to explain to me, really, when you're a surgeon and someone, comes to you with gangrene, what is it that's made the gangrene happen from diabetes and from sugar?
As an orthopedic surgeon, I looked after for many, many years, probably 20 years, most of the diabetic foot complications in northern Tasmania. And so, without being, too visual about it, every Friday afternoon, my clinic was full of patients with rotting flesh.
Wow.
And ultimately, I took a stand on that. They used to be called Fettke's effed up fructose-free fungating foot folly Fridays.
That is fantastic alliteration.
I don't know what the effed up meant, but it essentially. But and seriously, so I'd say that come to my students, I'd say, look, you're never going to see this again here in the Western world. This is where they all come. Not all, but the vast majority of them.
Yeah.
And I had these patients in hospital with diabetes and poorly controlled blood sugars. And my patients were being fed ice cream 3 times a day because other hospital food guidelines. And I started going, hang on, this is crazy. Often as a surgeon, as doctors, as health professionals, we're too busy. We're just working away. But so the moment I stood back from this and went, hang on, stop feeding my patients ice cream. And they said, no, that's the hospital guidelines. I said, well, let's actually change them. They said, we can't change the hospital guidelines because they're national guidelines, they're state guidelines, national guidelines. And so they said, if you need to change it, you probably need to change the guidelines yourself. And I said, okay, let's bring it on. But in the process of challenging that system and challenging the whole hospital food guidelines, and then challenging the cereal industry, the sugar industry, the processed food industry, I ended up getting reported to the medical board 3 times as a doctor not allowed to give nutritional advice. And that went on for 3 years. It was found against me. I wasn't allowed to talk about nutrition, but I kept doing it. Took me another 2 years, 3 Senate inquiries, lots and lots of support from the people, and social media, thank goodness, actually helped me in that scenario, because it was just ludicrous. Here it is, I'm just sick and tired of chopping off limbs, trimming back people's rotting flesh every week, and I wasn't allowed to advise my diabetic patients to reduce eating sugar. In the process of that defense, personally, I ended up going back to my biochemistry, going back and relearning it and actually really challenging it. Became a very enthusiastic, mature age student. And it's there. It's not hard. You just go looking for it. The information's there. But we as busy health professionals follow the guidelines, do as you've always done. Someone comes in with diabetics, you've got to change your lifestyle. You've got to exercise more.
Yeah.
And here, we'll give you some medications to bring your glucose down. Every diabetic medication that's given to a patient doesn't need to be given. I'm talking about type 2. They fall into different categories. And again, I'm simplifying it down. There are those things like insulin, which actually push the glucose that you eat into your tissues. There are ones which actually decrease the absorption of the glucose that you eat. Then you've got those that actually make you pass it in your urine. Again, it's what you eat. And that pretty well covers the 3 of them. There's some that increase the ability of insulin to work, but effectively that's still pushing it in the tissues. All of those drugs can be reduced or removed if you don't eat the glucose in the first place. So that question I asked Look Tappy was critical. That question that talk about glucose, how much is required in the body? How much do we need to ingest? Well, we don't need to eat any glucose or fructose or carbohydrate ever.
Yeah.
They're biochemically. I mean, it's really hard to not. I mean, even meat has a little bit of carbohydrate in it. Above ground vegetables have a little bit of carbohydrate. I'm not talking about 0 carb, but biochemically, we don't need to have it. And all the medications which are just dished out are actually there to reduce the amount of glucose in our bloodstream by negating the effects of actually eating it. So that was the simplest simplistic view I started with. If you don't eat the glucose, you don't need the medications. If you don't eat the glucose, you don't have type 2 diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually, you can put it into remission, you can put it into reverse, and that depends on how much commitment you have. And the health system as a whole says it's too hard for people to do this. And that's BS. If you're given what Belinda's always called, my wife Belinda, she's done an enormous amount of work into the vested interests behind shaping guidelines. So if you give people SAM, you give them support, accountability, motivation. And that's what David Unwin's program is, which he's done in the UK. And we've stayed with David and the family, an awesome time. We're just chatting, and it was great. But that's what David does. He gives people simple information, but he gives them support. He gets them back, which makes them accountable, and he makes them motivated.
Yeah.
And that's what low carb does to people. It makes people motivated for the very first time in people's lives, particularly with diabetes and often with obesity and other multiple health issues. They can take back a little bit of control. They can empower themselves. And that's brought back the joy of medicine to me, because I can tell you, just chopping up bits of flesh and, counseling people about, okay, this is the next step and the next step and the next step. That's not fun medicine.
Yeah, I imagine. And it's firefighting as well, isn't it? And I think, I don't know what the system is in Australia. I do apologise. But of course, in this country, the NHS, I think the NHS is on its knees for multiple reasons. But one of them is the fact that they are just, doctors and nurses and medical teams are just trying to fight fires all the time. There's no actual plan, I would say, which works for most people just to be healthy and not need as much medical attention, but rather I think it's about 10%, £10 billion is spent on type 2 diabetes in this country. Well, total type diabetes, but most of that is type 2 diabetes. And you think if that money was spent maybe on people's food or in other areas of life, what a massive increase that could have. But also those people wouldn't need the treatment so much because they wouldn't be crashing into type 2 diabetes. So it just seems like a really upside down way we've got things going at the moment.
You've opened up Pandora's box there, because metabolic health disease is most of what we're seeing in medicine. And we're not type 2 diabetes or type 3 diabetes with dementia or the complications of type 2 diabetes. It's almost impossible to put a monetary value on it.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's generational as well, isn't it? And just out of interest, Gary, has that got worse over your career? Or has it always been bad? Right.
Okay. Absolutely. It's like, obesity's gotten bigger, arthritis has gotten bigger. In that low carb, that carb talk, that last one I did, I talk about how inflammation is tied up with insulin secretion. And osteoarthritis of joints is tied up with insulin secretion. So you can actually reduce your insulin secretion by going low carb and improve your arthritis before you lose weight. But hundreds and hundreds of examples of it. It's just fascinating. People come back 2 weeks later, look, my pain's gotten better. 6 weeks later, my pain's gotten better. And I've lost 1 kilo. Well, clearly the weight isn't the issue.
Yes, yeah.
It's the insulin. The mechanism is inflammation has decreased, but reducing insulin secretion, which is what our bodies does to what we eat, improves outcomes.
I just suddenly realised something then, Gary. So over Christmas, I had a really stiff ankle and every day it was hurting me. And I was cycling, it was hurting in the morning. I would just sit down for a while, it'd be hurting. I've gone very strict carnivore the last sort of 2 weeks and I've had no pain, but I didn't even think of that. And my weight hasn't gone down hugely in that time, although I am trying to lose a bit of weight at the moment, but actually the pain has gone. And I just suddenly realized when you said that, hang on, my ankle's not hurt for ages. That's inflammation, right?
That's inflammation, but that work came out of China in 2000. So not everything bad came out of China in 2000, okay?
Wow. So hang on. So this is Chinese paper, and it's only 2000. That's not that long ago, really, is it? But they're not. But 22 years. You think we'd have heard about this?
No, 2020. Sorry. 2020.
Oh, 2020. Oh, I see. Right. Okay. Very recent.
Brand new.
Brand new.
But what was really interesting in that paper is at the end of it, they said quite clearly there's a dose-related response between insulin and inflammation, and what we need to do is direct our medications at insulin. They completely missed the point in conclusions that the way to reduce insulin is to go low carb.
It's incredible. This happens a lot, doesn't it? It's like You know,
I
it's
looked
like,
at one of the great things about Twitter and social media is someone sent me this paper. They said, "I think you'd be interested in this," and I went, "Oh, what a find!"
yeah,
And that's the whole idea about networking. People send you stuff, and you get, it's like, I'm the end bit of a filter of stuff that comes in. Several groups on the back end of what's that thing? Email, yeah, okay, and Twitter and all that, and it's exhausting to keep up to date with it but that's part of it.
yeah.
But when the other things about the system's not set up to cure or to put people into remission, and I often talk about the time frame on return on investment in preventative healthcare is longer than one electoral term.
Yes, yeah,
You know,
exactly.
like
Yeah.
the politician that I was talking about, he's got no interest in actually stirring up a hornet's nest by upsetting the food industry and the sponsors and the people that pay for their advertising, because that he needs to get re-elected in 3 years' time.
Well, can
So
I
what?
share something with you on that, Gary? So this is something you don't know about me, and it's a bit embarrassing to say on a podcast. So I've stood for Parliament 3 times in this country now for the Labour Party, and I really think Tony Benn said, and I went to a talk where he said this actually. There are 2 types of politician. They're the ones who are like the weather vane, so the weathercock that spins in the wind. So depending on what the latest fashion is, depending on what the people want, they'll just go in that direction. And then he said there are other politicians who are like a signpost. They literally point to the thing that they want to achieve in their career, and they don't deviate from that one thing. And for me, I realized, because I stood in South Cambridgeshire, which is where I am now, actually. And the MP who was here was a minister. He brought through the Health and Social Act. And I thought, right, I really care about health, so I'm going to stand in for Parliament. But I've decided if I ever get elected, and I'm going to keep trying until either I die or I get deselected or whatever, tackling sugar would be my focus, because that is, I think, a worthwhile mission for life. It's going to make the biggest difference to people. And also, I think when I first did in 2015, I didn't appreciate that the world we're in now is going more towards sugar, not less towards sugar. Like, if you think about, for instance, like, the vegan diet is very sugar based, very carb based as well. And that kind of really scares me, because it's actually getting worse, not better. And that's what makes me feel like we have to focus on this in politics. And if I was ever elected, that would be my one manifesto promise, to make sure I took on sugar however I could.
I tend to have a bit more of a Gatling gun approach.
You are Australian, so go on.
I know, because it's not one thing. Unfortunately, it's multifaceted.
Yes.
Because if you really just tackle sugar, all of a sudden someone's going to be tackling salt, and they're going to be tackling,
Yeah.
oh, we've got to bring a sugar tax. Okay, we need to bring in a salt tax, and we need to bring in a meat tax. All of things which aren't based on good science, but there's a lot of political money and agendas floating around with it. So one of those things about just why health can't change. It can't change because the timeframes of return on investment are too long.
Yeah.
We know with diabetes, it's actually within a week. I got into trouble for irresponsibly. I got reported to the medical board on one occasion for irresponsibly, claiming to put someone's type 2 diabetes into remission, which we did on national TV. I'm sorry.
You get in trouble for that? Unbelievable.
but this is what happens, because I became targeted by the food industry. I get targeted by the processed food industry, and very specifically by the cereal industry. It took some years to uncover, but that's what happened. The other thing is that it's actually sort of not in the interest of the health professionals to actually make people better. Because if you want to do low carb or encourage someone to do low carb, it takes time to have the first conversation, time to support people, and it isn't remunerated very well.
Yeah.
Counselling is not remunerated very well. And then the other thing is that what we call generational education, and you touched on it before, you tend to practice what your teachers taught you. And if their teachers taught exactly the same thing. And again, there's another one of my talks which builds on Belinda's work, called The Failure of Medical Education. And when you actually realize that our medicine was railroaded literally by Carnegie and Rockefeller back in 1910 with the Flexner report, and realized that the pharmaceutical industry was born at that point in time and holistic medicine went out the window. So all of our textbooks for 110 years have been written by the pharmaceutical industry pretty well.
Wow. I didn't
But
know that. That's
in
shocking.
1917, October 1917, the American Dietetics Association was formed, largely by Leonard Cooper. Leonard Cooper was working for a fellow by the name of John Harvey Kellogg or thereabouts, and she was a vegan, and she was instrumental in writing the next 40 years of textbooks for the dietetics associations. And then the Canadian, the British, the Australian, New Zealand, South African dietetics associations all followed suit using the same textbooks, which when you go back, and we've actually gotten some of those textbooks from 1920s, they are actually vegan textbooks pushing the process of cereals and grains. And when you actually realize that the whole start of dietetics for the world, the Western world, was started by John Harvey Kellogg's minions, and they were all practicing under the umbrella of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which is a vegan organization. And everyone goes, oh, the vegans couldn't be, the vegan church couldn't be running so much. But they have in fact been the catalyst for the vegan scenario. They've been the catalyst for the food pyramids. They've been effectively writing the dietary guidelines for the Western world and the textbooks for over 100 years. And they are deeply committed to doing that. In 2019, they actually published a paper acknowledging everything I've just said. They're deeply committed right through to United Nations, World Health Organization, dietary guidelines, review bodies, and they effectively own the cereal industry of the world. They started the fake meat industries of the world. They own the soy industry of the world. They started all these things. And when you actually realize that that's where the source of the propaganda is, which is the anti-animal based agriculture, the pro-vegan agriculture, the pro-cereal and grain, the pro-carb, then that all of a sudden the jigsaw pieces come together. You will have, caught up with Tim Noakes, I presume, at some point in time, and Tim's a dear friend. And that explosion of Belinda's work, I presented at CrossFit in 2017. I said, I'm not going to let you stand up in the Midwest of the US and give a talk and break into the religion aspect. It was over 1,000 people in the audience. A few people got up when I actually crossed that boundary of talking about religion. In politics and nutrition. The talk was a central role of nutrition in everything, but effectively we crossed that. And I've never, ever stood on the edge of Niagara Falls and gone over the edge, but I felt like it at that point in time. There's no coming back from this, and we kept plowing through. But in the front row there was Tim Noakes. He was just grinning from ear to ear because the day before I'd caught up with Tim and Greg Glassman, who owns CrossFit, and I said, this is what the talk's going to be. And for Tim, he just, all of a sudden, these pennies were dropping. He just went, I understand now why he'd been done over, why I'd been done over. It's incestuous, the whole world. The dietitian and who went after Tim Noakes in South Africa is friends with the dietitian who runs the board of the dietitians here in Australia, and has been in the same meetings as the expert witness that was against me.
Wow, I didn't know that. That's incredible. So it's all linked together, really, isn't it?
Look, when Tim's case was going through, his was an open court. Mine was a closed court. It didn't get nearly the media, which is fine. But effectively, Tim and I cross-referenced each other. And the very first person Belinda and I rang was Tim. And I can still remember he was in Cape Town having a morning cup of coffee, and he had his laptop there, and we FaceTimed, and we just said, Tim, I'm off. And he'd gotten off about 3 months before. It was really, really important.
That's amazing.
Tim and I had our cases cleared so that healthcare professionals could start talking about low carb and reducing sugar for patients across the board, but particularly diabetes.
So was that in 2017? Because I went to Low Carb USA, and I think I remember they announced that Tim had got off something at the time in the summer of 2017. I think that's when I was there.
Mine was 2018, so it must have
2018, maybe it was a year after then. I can't remember when I was there now. Yeah. That's
And
amazing.
it had taken us both 5 years.
Do you think then that they want to scare you just to keep your mouth shut rather than? But in this world, you've Tim Noakes and you go back 50 years. Would you have even known each other or had a chance to communicate? But
Not a chance.
the fact with Twitter, with the internet the way it is, we can stand together as a community and say, I'm not going to be bullied by anyone. I'm going to stand up for the truth, and that's what you did.
Oh, look, it was critical when the medical board came down against me, effectively silencing my ability to give nutritional advice. And the one question they actually asked me, medical board, face to my face, was, Dr. Fettke, do you think that advising your patients to reduce their sugar intake is specific nutritional advice? Now, see it in my memory. My lawyer was sitting behind me. He wasn't allowed to counsel me. He should have said no. He said to me afterwards, he probably should have said no there, but I said yes. It is nutritional advice. Don't eat sugar if you've got diabetes. I don't have a problem with it.
Yeah.
And that was the one question that they decided, okay, that's the one verbal answer I gave. Okay, they wanted to take away my ability to advise patients. Now, Belinda put a post up on social media about that because literally they wanted to take away my license for that. That had over 1 million viewings.
Wow.
And all of a sudden, the community came behind me and started, Twitter, Facebook, emails to APRA, the medical board. They wouldn't overturn their thing, but it did provoke media releases against me, quite defamatory statements by the medical board, which had retracted. I've been apologised to. I haven't been remunerated, I can guarantee that.
Oh, really? Wow.
Oh, we're down several $100,000.
I bet you are. Must be cost a fortune, legal fees. Yeah.
We're just a couple of state school kids, and okay, I'm an orthopedic surgeon, but it did hurt retirement plans.
I bet it did.
But the right thing is that it was done, and it has literally opened the door in Australia, South Africa, New Zealand. The UK's got slightly different rules over there, but I also know that practitioners in the UK and the US have been under fire. Annika Dahlqvist in Sweden was caught up in that whole process before Tim and myself.
Mm.
But now, if you're a healthcare professional and you want to talk low carb and you want to talk reducing sugar, the door is wide open. In 2020, the Australian of the Year, Dr. James Mookie, got up there. He's an ophthalmologist, and he was sick and tired of seeing, diabetic eye problems. And his opening speech was, you've got to reduce sugar. Really gave it an enormous platform. Within a day, he was under attack by the sugar industry.
Wow.
Now, James and I have become really good mates since then, because he was naive. He didn't understand the politics by standing up and actually, talking about the vices of sugar. But he's done some great work, and we're doing some ongoing work with the New Diabetes Reform Network going forward. Again, just trying to actually get this message out in different platforms.
Fantastic. Can I just ask though, wasn't one of the things they raised that you had said the food in the hospitals that was being served was killing your patients, and somebody attacked you on that because it wasn't specific enough to say they'd literally died in hospital? I mean, how ludicrous is that?
I've had some allies within the system, and I was actually asked to give a plenary speech at the National Hospital Food Industry, which is, probably as good a platform as you're going to get, because they're talking about hospital food, nursing home food, institutional food. And my second slide was hospital food is crap and it's killing my patients. Because literally, you come in with diabetes and you've been given ice cream 3 times a day. And apart from the fact that it's highly processed, highly carb laden, blood glucose is all out of control. And it's a figure of speech. That's what I try to explain. Hospital food is crap and it's killing my patients. If you're setting the example in hospital that it's okay to have ice cream with diabetes, then over a long period of time, it's going to kill the patients. Anyway, I got reported to, one of the things they investigated with APRA is they then wrote to the hospital, who had issues, they were under union pressure from the dietitians who were being paid for by the cereal industry. But not long and the short of it, the hospital said, we have no documented evidence that any patient specifically died whilst in hospital as a result of hospital food. I mean, and then there's another letter reply. This is a figure of speech. Okay.
You know what, then? I've got an idea, Gary. We should introduce cigarettes given out at hospitals, because I guarantee no one's going to die of 1 or 2 cigarettes when they stay in hospital. So it must be fine, according to these people, because clearly give them out of hospital, it won't kill you. It's so stupid.
You know, I'm old enough to remember that the pink ladies, volunteer ladies, used to come around with a trolley and sell cigarettes to the patients in the ward.
Oh, really? Wow.
And and Belinda's first job as a junior nurse, and no, we started going out before we were doctor and nurse, by the way. Okay, I cradle snatched her when she was in high school, but anyway, the 1816. Okay, just to clarify that, so it wasn't too much cradle snatch. Good investment, return on investment with Belinda. Excellent. Okay.
Okay.
Anyway, her first job as a nurse was to clean the ashtrays out.
Really? Oh my word! Incredible.
So we at some point in time we worked out that this wasn't a good idea for patients to be smoking on the ward. We worked out the perils of it. We need to be at that point now. To say,
but Gary, nobody died of smoking in hospital. So what are you worried about?
No,
I'm being facetious, but you get my point. It's crazy, isn't it? It's crazy.
But at some point in time, we now need to embrace that. Now, my local public hospital, I pointed out on social media that the hospital Christmas raffle was a Coca-Cola push bike that was actually given to the hospital auxiliary because of the amount of Coca-Cola they'd sold.
Oh, what an achievement that is.
But the hospital auxiliary, and I don't mind talking about it because it was the CEO of the hospital told me, he said, we need the money that the hospital auxiliary raise so we can buy bariatric beds and bariatric chairs.
Wow.
So literally, the hospital auxiliary is selling Coca-Cola and junk food and what we call red foods on the red traffic light system. It's just laden 90% junk food.
Yeah.
And the money that's raised by the hospital auxiliary goes to buying bariatric beds, bariatric chairs, and for aiding those patients who are literally in hospital because of the metabolic health consequences of what they're eating. This isn't a hospital system. The hospital should be pillars of health, not not the slums of denigration. It's just.
It is shocking, but then it's going to break, because surely that's not sustainable. Things can't go on forever. And if you look at healthcare systems, they get more and more expensive over time. I mean, I think the push here in this country is from some quarters to privatize medicine, but that doesn't fix the problem. I think actually socialized healthcare is a wonderful thing, but if it's used for conditions that we can't treat with lifestyle, and if you need it because you break your arm, you need it because whatever happens to you, and it's there for you, but it can't patch up a bad diet. And I think that's what people are realizing more and more, that you don't have to get older and get sick. You don't have to kind of put on weight as you get older. Like, that's just the norm, because that's just weird. You don't have to have osteoarthritis over time as you get older, because people just have kind of got used to accepting these things with time. But actually, so much of it is lifestyle. And if we just tackled that, then our whole outlook would be different, wouldn't it?
But the great word lifestyle is all encompassing, and it's almost as non-specific as the Mediterranean diet. You guys are closer to the Mediterranean.
Doesn't feel like
we
it.
are, but where is the Mediterranean? Is it a Eastern?
It's Israel, it's Morocco, it's Spain, it's Greece. I mean, all the same country, basically.
Yeah, all with exactly the same food. But so lifestyle, and so it's all embraced. All preventative health measures start with lifestyle changes. And there is, in that sector, there's so much disinformation. I call it not misinformation. I call it deliberate misinformation, which is put there by the food industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and religious organizations. It's deliberate. And it's so entrenched in our education that it's nearly impossible to change. It's so entrenched in our guidelines that it's nearly impossible to change. We're going to keep chipping away at it. But the important thing about your community our community, that low carb community, as the individual is completely empowered to do exactly what they want to do this afternoon, today.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you've got a choice of whatever you want to eat. You've got a choice of not eating. That's thing called fasting, crikey. So we've evolved with fasting. I actually worked out the biochemistry of religion.
Oh, really? Oh, wow. Here we go. I'd love to hear this.
Oh no, I turned it into it's a short 3-minute talk, but it was part of one of those carb talks that I gave in South Africa years ago. But it dawned on me that nutritional ketosis is actually the biochemistry of religion. So when you fast, you actually move into ketosis. And we know that ketosis has ability to cleanse cells, cleanse mitochondria. People spiritually talk about a clearing of the soul. They can think clearer, they feel better, they improve their health. Every religion observes periods of fasting.
Even Jesus did. He went out into the desert for 40 days, 40 nights. Yeah.
That's right. Whether you've got Lent, you've got Ramadan, I've got a blank. They fast from lunch till the sun goes down.
Oh, in Ramadan they do that. Oh, Buddhists, right? Yeah.
And so they do that every day. That's called intermittent fasting.
Yeah.
And so when you actually look at it, so for thousands of years, religions have observed fasting, but they've recognised that they didn't realise that was actually a period of nutritional ketosis.
It's fascinating.
And that can extrapolate to pregnancy as well.
Oh, really? Oh, you mean like this feeling of euphoria from pregnancy because of ketosis?
No. I realise as an orthopaedic surgeon, I go down all sorts of different rabbit warrens.
Yeah, this is wonderful.
I'm a grandparent now, a couple of times over. In fact, they're asleep in the room next door. We've got 8 in the house again tonight. And sort of
8. Blooming 8, Gary. You keep yourself busy, don't you?
Look, the good news is our kids have settled on a house today, and 4 of them are moving out tomorrow.
Oh, fantastic. Yay! I mean, I'm going to miss you guys, but seriously.
That's only just down the road, but nonetheless, it's
down the road. That's the main thing.
Well, they moved back with COVID, and Kate was pregnant, and she couldn't find nappies or food in Melbourne. And I said, get on a plane, come on home. We've got food, we've got nappies. And literally the following day, Melbourne locked down. And
wow, she got out just in time then.
So she literally got out. She was 6 months pregnant, but right through that pregnancy, she was really crook.
Sorry, what does crook mean for non-Australians?
Unwell, morning sickness.
Oh, right. Yeah, crook. Sure, she was crook.
So, like really, really sick. And it made me actually think, well, you're in ketosis. You can't eat. You're clearly in ketosis. We tested her a few times and she was in ketosis. And I started to think, actually, well, is this good or bad? So then I thought, actually, what's the best experiment you can do to work out if keto is safe?
Mm-hmm.
If going low carb and not eating and fasting is if it's safe. So what you want to do is you want a controlled experiment. You want to inflict that on the most susceptible human being you can. So the most susceptible human being we have is an embryo. It's right at the beginning of life, and it's actually critical time frame is that pregnancy, and particularly the first trimester when morning sickness is often the worst. And so you want to do that experiment. Again, if you're going to make up an experiment as to whether or not keto or low carb is safe, okay, you want to have the most susceptible people, which are babies, or in the womb. You then want to do the test on tens of thousands. You want to test them in multiple countries, and you want to develop firm endpoints. So the firm endpoints you can actually test for, you can test for the pregnancy, miscarriage, you can test for birth weights, you can test for deformities. You can then follow those children and test for their IQ and their learning abilities and their growths. And you can do exactly the same experiment on the same kids with called gestational diabetes. So I don't need to do the experiment because this test has actually been already done on tens of thousands of children, babies.
Yeah.
When you look at the literature, there's 50, 60, 100,000 results there looking at what happens to babies with where the mothers have severe morning sickness. And the old wives' tale is don't worry. Well, guess what? It's entirely accurate. If you're in, the more severe your morning sickness, the more likely is the mother is to go to full term. There's a lower miscarriage rate. The babies
Oh,
are more
really? I
likely
didn't
to
know
be
that. Wow.
normal birth weight.
Yeah.
They're likely to have less deformities.
Yeah.
They have better IQ and they have better learning ability.
Amazing.
Then you take the converse, which is gestational diabetes. Again, well documented, tens of thousands of results. The more severe and poorly controlled the diabetes, the more likely the baby is to not go to term, the more likely there is to be miscarriages, there's more likely to be high and low birth weights, there's more likely to be more congenital abnormalities, and they are environmental ones like cardiac, which are related to the pregnancy, not your chromosomes.
Wow.
And those kids are more likely to have learning problems and growth disturbances.
That's why I'm here, actually. So my wife and I, when we were expecting our first, my daughter, who's now 6, she had gestational diabetes. Now, my wife is a doctor, so I can relate to how Belinda must feel. It's awful for us, but we get by anyway. And my wife's a doctor who decided, she wanted to not
Maybe
go
next podcast you do with Belinda is okay, and you can both
moan about you,
moan about your spouses. Don't you? Bring equal responsibility here.
If we do that, my wife and you have got to promise not to listen to that episode because that wouldn't be good. But no, she's a doctor she's an oncologist, and so she's just done a PhD and very much looking at the impact of sugar on cancer. But she was looking at the time at not going on artificial insulin. And she just said, you know what, I need to control this by diet. That's the best way I'm going to manage my diabetes. And she did. And she had less body fat by the end of the pregnancy than at the beginning. She was healthier than she'd ever been. She managed her blood sugars throughout. At the end, it got a bit more tricky because I think it does progress a bit more towards the later term of pregnancy. However, she managed it really well. So then when we then had our son, who's now 3, we went to go and see the consultant and the dietitian, and we were much more informed then because we'd seen Sarah Holberg's talk. We'd come across podcasts with yourself and David Unwin and Tim Noakes and all these amazing speakers. So we were really prepared this time, and we came in and we said, this is going to be a keto pregnancy. We now know how to do this properly. We'll get all the micronutrients. So don't worry, because that's what they always get scared about. We'll get the micronutrients sorted out, but the macros are going to be like cutting back on carbohydrate and increasing things like, healthy fats and protein. And they completely lost it. They lost their shit, if I can put it that way, because they looked at us like we were somehow new age hippies who were going to damage our baby, and that this was just woo stuff. And so we said, look, no, we actually know the research. Well, my wife's not a stupid person. She studies here at Cambridge. She said, I've looked at the research. I know that this stuff works, and it's worked for us individually in our health journeys, so we're going to try it. And they said, look, we don't have any hard evidence to say that you shouldn't do that, apart from you'll get into ketoacidosis. And I said, no, that's not true. Even I know that's not true. They said, however, just trust us. We've been giving this advice for a long time. We know what we're talking about. And even though we haven't got any hard facts to give you or research papers, we know this is best from our experience and we're trained in it. And that was their answer. And I was absolutely horrified of how poor an answer that was. I really thought they're going to come back at me with, here's a study that would kind of combat what you're saying, or that's not true, because they didn't have any of that. It just fell back on reputation.
Now you can quote, look, there's this orthopedic surgeon in Tasmania who says you're full of crap.
Yeah.
And here is his reference talk, which has got 40 references in it, which actually backs the statement. It's a reassuring, and our grandchildren are low carb. They're not keto, and they do have some fruits in there, and they have a little bit of, tiny, small amounts of carb. They're healthy and they're fine. Like, that's not a controlled trial.
Yeah.
Kate's pregnancies were relatively low carb and at times in keto. I know of many women who have had keto pregnancies without any problems. And so the brain, a child's brain development is dependent on ketones crossing the placental barrier. It's not responsible. Carbohydrate, glucose, is not responsible for a baby or an embryo's growth. And the embryo, the fetus, the young child, even through to 4 and 5, spends significant amounts of time in ketosis. They drift into it very quickly the younger they are. So it is. I call it the safe operating. When on your computer, when all things go lousy, you go into ketosis. You can't find food. You're incredibly sick. You don't go down to McDonald's in the midst of when you're in intensive care. You move into ketosis. The safe operating system for the human body is ketosis.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what kids do. Kids stop eating when they feel ill. We stop eating when we feel ill. We know that we just want to not spend the energy on digesting food all the time. We're quite happy just to live off our own reserves and go into ketosis. You're quite right.
And our repair mechanisms are dependent on protein. Our fuel mechanisms are dependent on ketones. They're not dependent on carbohydrates. It's not required.
Yeah.
And again, I was brainwashed for decades. For the last dozen years, I haven't been brainwashed on this topic. And it just astounds me that it's still, when I found out that research on fructose, I literally said to Belinda, in 6 months' time, this will be a complete no-brainer. Everyone will have adopted this low carb, this low sugar concept, because it is that damaging.
Yeah.
And here we are 12 years down the track, still having a chat about it.
Years. But then I would say the positives are that the more you see this, the more that you can't unsee it, right? So, once you...
Hang on, that's my quote.
I know it is, and that's why I'm trying to pretend it's mine now. So
good stuff. I've called you on that one straight away. Right?
Oh dear, I'm just trying to, repurpose it. No, but you have said, and it's so true. I knew I'd heard it from a wise person. I didn't know it was you, Gary. No, I did. And it was, that is true though, and I've seen that in my own life. People come on this podcast. They, one lady had, she lost 15 stone, which is 100 kilos of body fat, which is a huge amount of body fat to lose over 2 years. And, you sort of think that Ilya was someone who had suffered all her life with, morbid obesity. I mean, really extreme. And that was how people saw her whole adult, in fact, her teenage years as well. So this is somebody who's very insulin resistant. And as soon as she cut the carbs over 2 years from having a stroke, she's now being told by doctors, you're actually in the slightly below average weight range for your age group. And she's surprised by this, like, what the heck's happened? Because she knows how she works now. Now, you think that story influences so many more people in her family, in her community.
I've debated the role of bariatric surgery within the College of Surgeons. Like we had a debate and I was asked to speak about bariatric surgery as lousy. And I'll still stand by that. But the number of people who actually have bariatric surgery haven't been offered. They've said, we've tried lifestyle intervention, we've tried diets. I said, have you tried low carb? And the vast majority of them haven't. But what's really interesting, in the preoperative workup for bariatric surgery, patients are given 4 to 6 to 8 weeks of a very low carb, low calorie intake.
Okay.
And the reason to do that is to shrink the liver down.
Because it's of course full of...
It's full of fat. It's got non-alcoholic fatty liver. And so the part of the surgical workup leading into surgery is for people to go low carb. And I've spoken to bariatric surgeons. I say, why don't you just keep going?
Yeah.
Again, there's no money in it. There's no money in actually not doing bariatric surgery. I've done... And again, you've got to support people appropriately after bariatric surgery. And Rob Sires in the US, South African surgeon originally, but he's done an enormous amount of work. There's still a role for bariatric surgery, but it's in conjunction with low carb. It's in conjunction with psychological assessment and support. But again, come back to support. You need to support people. And that whole, but I've done the number crunch here in Tasmania. If we look at the number of let's talk about 1% of, on average, 1% of the population is getting fatter every year into obesity. And the national guidelines here in Australia, that if the BMI is more than 35 or 30 with comorbidities, then you're a candidate for bariatric surgery. Now, 1% of the population is moving into that situation every year. I've done a number crunch on that. If we take that 1% here in Tasmania and do bariatric surgery on that 1%, it would mean turning over every single public hospital operating list every weekday, so 5 days a week, to just doing bariatric surgery, and you still wouldn't get through the new 1%.
Oh my word, that's a car crash.
So bariatric surgery as an answer to obesity
is not the right
and
one.
diabetes. It's just totally non-sustainable. So I've said to my surgical colleagues, look, it's fine, guys, you can keep making money on the side, but you're not addressing the root cause.
But then I know also people have had bariatric surgery who then say afterwards they get into trouble by having the Western diet. And many of them have to then adapt to keto as well, because they realize it isn't the answer. It might help them and great if it does for them, but they actually have to also have the keto alongside that, like you said, to make the difference.
The number of people who have actually, we ran a group, a group of dietitians and support people and diabetes educator called Nutrition for Life. We handed it across to the team so nobody can accuse us of having a conflict of interest. And they're still working and getting great results. Again, you need to support people. It's just, you can't do low carb for one day and be cured. You can't have an operation for one day and be cured of a lifestyle condition.
You can't eat ice cream one time and die in hospital.
Same. You can.
Yeah. Well, not. Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Yeah, you're quite right. That's quite scary. But I think it's like, you know, this is what Andreas said at Low Carb USA about the fact that people now have to surgically change their body because they're not eating the food that's right for their evolution. And I thought, yeah, that's a really good way of looking at it. We instead of changing the food, we change ourselves. That's wrong. That's clearly not the right answer, is it? And I appreciate it does work for some people, and that's great. But without keto and low carb, you're always going to run into this problem, aren't you?
We should be eating for our nutritional requirements. And there's a lot in that statement. If you actually eat for what you nutritionally require, there are essential proteins, there are essential fats, there are micronutrients that we eat, that we require, but we don't need energy very much because we've got truckloads of it.
Yeah.
And the classic example is a pizza, where you'll eat a pizza and it'll have lots of colors on it, but it's predominantly highly processed food. And so you've clearly had enough energy requirements in it, but it's been nutritionally depleted. So what do? You eat a second pizza.
Yeah.
Or we've gone out for an evening of Chinese food. Sorry, I'm not, I'm just picking that because we used to eat a lot of that, which had a lot of rice in it.
Yeah, and a lot of sugar, quite often as well.
A lot of sugar to cover the spices.
Yeah.
And so therefore you'd be on your way home and you'd want to stop for food.
Yeah.
Or you've had a night out in the town. You want to come home and you want to raid the ice cream at home because you haven't eaten to nutritionally complete it. Have you ever been to I presume you have a Brazilian meal?
Where they have the sort of meat at the table cut for you. Yeah. And they also have, by the way, I'm sure you do the same as me, they have the starter area full of like carby, like hors d'oeuvres. Avoid those. I'm like, come on. I know that's the cheap stuff and it's also nasty for your health. I'm going to stick over here with the steaks. Thanks very much. Yeah.
Well, my first experience of that was in Indonesia with low carb Indonesia. Eric Westman and Georgia Reed and our partners all went to there and actually it was an amazing thing to do the very first Southeast Asian low carb meeting. It's just a great honor. And the second time I did it was with Belinda. I did it with Nina Tychols. And I've only done it twice, but literally after you just can't eat anymore.
Yeah.
Because you've actually hit all of your nutrition.
Yeah.
And your micronutrients, and your body said, nope, you're full. Tank's full. Stop.
Yeah, I've never been more full than when I was a carnivore, and I think, but eaten less as well. That's the thing when you go carnivore, you don't actually like eat a steak and then a steak for your mashed potato and then another steak for your peas. You just eat the one steak and you're fine. And you realize that actually people are overeating on the other stuff, and then they want a dessert afterwards, and you're like, I couldn't fit that in. What? How are you doing it? And it's interesting that, isn't it? Which your protein levels in particular, I find, are met for the day. You really are absolutely fine for food. You don't want it at
A
all.
lot of it comes back to fructose. The amount of fructose that comes in that meal, which is either half of sugar, or if you're insulin resistant, then 30% of the glucose you eat actually gets flipped into fructose. And fructose will drive behavior, will make you hungry.
So there you go. So you go crazy for it because it's like, well, I suppose it'll be February, March time in Australia, you're eating all the harvest fruits, and August, September in the northern hemisphere, and we're going crazy for evolution to fatten up for hibernation, I suppose. So we go mad for it.
That's it. I mean, an animal, or here we've got possums, we've got plenty of them. They will strip a fruit tree bare when the fruit ripens so it can get fat for winter hibernation.
Yeah. And actually, do you know the evolution of the apple? This is one of my facts. My degree's in archaeology and anthropology. And we looked at the evolution of the apple and how it traveled from Russia across to Europe. And this is all through bear droppings. So the bears are eating them, like you just said there. They're getting really fat for winter. Then they migrate across into like the West. And as they do, they leave the droppings behind. And so the seeds grow and then the apple tree appears or whatever. And you can actually see the apple slowly going into Europe, all through hibernating animals and their migration over time. It's fascinating.
It takes me down two pathways. One's the potato. You can apparently track the evolution of arthritis by the dissipation of potato.
I didn't know that.
Originally, it's a South American root vegetable, and as it's become westernized, you get the development of osteoarthritis as hand in hand with it. But coming back to the animal droppings and fructose, one of the things, there's a talk of mine about fruit on, I don't mean to advertise my talks, but nonetheless.
No, please do.
If I go down tangents, it's because here, there's a whole talk on, is fruit bad for you? And it came to, I've tried to work out why fruit wants us to eat it.
Yeah.
Why does it get red, bright, orange, yellow? Why does it get shiny and bright? It's like a lyrebird. It's there to attract us. It gets sweeter, not for itself. It gets sweeter for us.
Yeah.
So why does the fruit do that? So essentially, the fruit wants us to actually. It's part of its survival mechanism. It literally advertises to us as animals, birds, bears, to eat it, do the droppings, and move it away. The only trouble is that fruit isn't that intelligent. It hasn't worked out that humans drop the seed into a porcelain bowl now.
Well, I disagree with you there, Gary, because fruit plants are one of the most ubiquitous plants on the whole planet. So maybe it's not directly through our droppings, but the fact that they are luscious and really, it's sex, isn't it? It's procreation. That's what the tree's doing. And it's worked so well that we actually protect it, kill any of its predators like insects and whatnot. And we grow thousands and millions of these plants. And we look after them. So I guess in another way, because they are so successful on the planet, that shows how it works so well, doesn't it?
Except for the fact that in that process that we've actually screwed with them because our bee populations are dropping down because of that harvesting technique.
True.
I mean, part of talking about low carb and real food and anti-processed food is that you have to become an environmentalist as well, because it's part of the debate, part of the argument. So, how do we make our food sustainable and processed food? And I'll put the fruit trees into that as part of that equation. And the decline in bee populations around the world is potentially cataclysmic.
I totally agree with you on that. Yeah. And the fact that we've got some real problems just on environmentalism there, it really annoys me that people say, they have an Apple phone made in maybe China or another part of the world that's imported to them. They eat avocado on toast for breakfast, imported from, South and Middle America. And I think, what is wrong with you people? Like, I personally have got a bit of a thing about asparagus. I'm a bit of an asparagus addict. And I only have the stuff in the Northern Hemisphere between May and June, and that's it. because that's when it's seasonal. So I really enjoy asparagus. I'll eat it all month. I'll enjoy the stuff. If I got offered some in the middle of February or December, I know that's just the wrong season, and I just say no, because I know it's been imported from another part of the world, and we've got to change that mindset. It's really damaging.
Just to let the listeners know that I'm actually not a carnivore, because I'm clearly an omnivore. We have a patch of asparagus, which gives us a dozen to 20 spears of asparagus every day for that 4 or 5 months. It's just phenomenal. It looks like we have to get rid of it. We can't possibly eat that much asparagus.
I'm coming over. Although that does kind of, I suppose, make it less local if I'm having to travel the other side of the planet just to go and eat it.
Oh, no,
but
you might migrate down here. Zoe Harkham and her husband and Belinda and myself, we get on the catch up regularly. And we're trying to work out who's moving. We're either moving to Wales or they're moving to Tasmania. So we haven't quite worked out which one. So
I think Tasmania would win. No offense to Wales. I love the country, but I think Tasmania would be pretty cool.
I've got no idea where they live. I mean, we've stayed with them, and everything Welsh is just completely unpronounceable. Zoe, we all went to the Welsh Parliament. And I still remember there in the Welsh Parliament, you could buy a Welsh Scrabble board.
I'm dyslexic. I'd be great at that.
And let's just say that there is a Welsh Scrabble board, okay? That says that's about it.
Hey, I've got a 15-letter word. Yay.
There are no vowels. That's okay.
So this is great, and I appreciate your time, Gary. And I know I said it'd be about an hour, and I think there's just one last thing I'd like to talk about. I was going to talk about osteoarthritis, and I've looked at some of the numbers, and I was going to talk about that, but I realised we've run out of time. So if we have time, I'll come on to that in a moment. But I want to talk about Carol Adams, because this is all very recent. This is very contemporary. For those of you who might not know, there was a debate that happens at the Oxford Union. So Oxford University and Cambridge University both have a union, and it's a society you belong to, and they have these debates. They get speakers to come in, and it's very much like a debate in Parliament in this country. They've got one side fighting against the other. They have a motion they discuss, and this motion that was discussed on this occasion was about, should we move beyond meat? So Carol Adams was a speaker, somebody I'd never heard of actually before this. I was new to this lady and her argument, but the thing that annoys me, and I'll come into her words in a moment, is that someone who says something a bit out there gets the attention, and that worries me somewhat with our society right now. How social media, the most outrageous, the most sometimes insulting or derogatory person can be the person who gets the attention. But just to quote some of the things she said, and then we can debate that together, Gary, what she said and what you think about it.
We're not giving her
we're on the same.
Yeah,
and we're on the same side as well, which doesn't really help, does it? You're quite right. But she said that one of the defining aspects of the colonial legacy is the ongoing white supremacist belief system and the ownership paradigm that when you own the land, you're entitled to it. And she goes on to say about how eating meat is actually a racist thing to do, that having a hamburger comes with misogyny, because it in fact affects global warming, and that affects women more in the southern hemisphere and the sort of poorer areas of the world than it does to men. And then she also said popular culture is flooded with references to sexy cows, sexy pigs, sexy chickens, sexy fishes. All these people want to have fun. They want to be pregnant. They want to be killed. This is the animals, that is, because this feminized sexuality wants to be eaten. It was really out there, and I was kind of like taken aback by it. It's actually Amber O'Hearn who shared it with me in the first place. So, she's in America, I'm in the UK, you're in Australia. This is clearly sort of traveled. So, thoughts, Gary? What did you think about what Carol Adams said?
To be fair, I didn't really know much about Carol Adams, and she's clearly got her own opinion. She has been writing on this topic, when you have a quick peek, and that you sent me that for commentary, and I haven't listened to the entire debate. Remembering debates are you take up a polarized position. That's how I ended up with my fruit talk. I was debating, is fruit good or bad for you? Found myself on the negative side, and then I was up against a professor of food science, and he sort of said, halfway through my debate, he actually conceded defeat. We didn't even need to go to a vote.
Oh, wow.
And again, the more you look into it. So she's been writing on this topic and the sexuality of meat and animal-based food for a long time. I haven't done a lot of research, but you gave me a topic to have a look at it. In Australia, I did actually hear about the comments that it was eating meat was a white supremacist ideological aspect. And I went, whoa, crikey, this is just out there, but I ignored it at the time. But you gave me the 12-minute viewing to have a peek at. She's clearly taken up polarized opinion and has one for a long period of time, and she's written books accordingly. But you need to, in fact, do some fact checking. And I don't know if someone actually did the right of reply. I mean, some of the things she was saying was completely and utterly factually incorrect. And once you actually find something that's factually incorrect, then what else is factually incorrect? And we can, that's, and so, these are unreferenced talks. My talks on the bottom of it, everything's got a reference, and it's, you can check it up. So her ideas about white supremacy and as meeting, that goes out the window, because the most impoverished nations of the world are so dependent on their animal-based food supply, not large amounts of it, but it's their wealth, it's their only probability to get decent, complete proteins. And so that's been looked at, that if you reduce meat, animal-based agriculture across the world, the people who are going to be most affected are those that are most impoverished and marginalized. Just a marginal increase in the amount of animal protein in African children has been associated with increased brain development. So, I mean, we can't afford to get rid of animal-based agriculture, and particularly in the impoverished nations. But she came out with this blinding statement: 1/3 of the land mass of the world is devoted to animal agriculture. 1/3 of the world, third of the land mass of the world is devoted to animal agriculture. Now, our arable land is around 3 to 4%. Of the world, of which most of that is actually tillable, so therefore you can put your crops on it. Animal-based agriculture is largely can be looked at all those grasslands. It's another 25%. So even if we actually, and it's not utilised, but clearly 1/3 of the land mass of the world is not devoted to agriculture.
Yeah.
There might be animals living there, but it's not animal agriculture. And then again, she ran down all those pathways of saying how much water is actually produced, required to actually take an animal to its full growth. And part of that equation is what's called green water. Animals, cows in particular, eat grass. Grass is grown because water lands on it. It's actually not that water would, and the cows actually only hold onto that water for a little while and then they pee it out. So they're processing it. It's through water. It's green water. I realise she's part of a debate. She's definitely polarised the situation. I've never actually thought that I've been a white supremacist, racist by eating meat. I'm clearly not racist. I'm white. I don't think I'm a supremacist, and I've never considered the sexuality of the animals, apart from the fact that I've got chickens and the hens lay eggs and the roosters don't.
Yeah, what happens to the boys though? They get eaten, don't they? If they're like, you think about cows and bullocks, it's the cows that live.
She had some extreme comments. It was part of an Oxford debate. She's gotten airtime. It'll help her book sales. Good luck to her, but I, without going through everything in it and in the limits of time, there were several things which were rhetoric and not factually correct.
Yeah.
And
you know what?
I can refer people to Frank Mittlomer's work on this, Peter Ballastat, both really smart, sensible people.
I'm talking to Peter Ballastat this afternoon, actually. He's coming on the podcast. So he's here today. Yeah, I will, for sure.
And ask him how his dogs are.
Okay, I will.
Okay. Gary Fettke said, ask how his dogs are, all right? So put that in. Peter's so smart in this area, but you've got a small number of people, again, and I'm not saying I've got no idea about Carol Adams, but that are taking this elitist point of view, and the Eat Lancet was a classic example project. When you start breaking it down and looking at the vested interests behind it, they come down to religion, largely related to the Adventist organizations, the processed food industry, the pharmaceutical industry. And I'm not being paranoid about it. It's not a conspiracy theory if it turns out to be, the fact. The fact is that you have a small number of groups of people, very powerful, very influential, who are coming up with these guidelines, which are completely unsustainable, but they're coming out with propaganda, which is being literally fed and swallowed by our young people. And that's, largely the vegan movement. The vegans have no idea about the history, don't realize it's actually come from one religious organization who's coming out with the propaganda. Yeah. I should, however, declare my conflict of interest in here. Last year, I was asked to be a meat ambassador for Meat and Livestock Australia.
Oh.
After I gave a talk at Beef 2021 where I sort of started raising all these topics. I'm completely and utterly unpaid for that, okay?
So hang on, you're telling me if I come for dinner, you've got the best asparagus at certain times of year and probably some of the best meat in Tasmania. Well, there you go. I'm coming now.
Well, you're invited. Lots of people do. We come there. To be fair, those people who have caught up with us have rarely recovered.
Okay, good. And on that bombshell, that's the end of my century episode with Gary Fettke. So I want to say a massive thank you to Gary for your time. And you really are, well, I've always heard this about you. You're the real nice guy of low carb. And I think that's definitely true. You've got such a way about you, which is so genuine and sincere. And I think that really cuts through and you think, oh, this guy actually cares about things. And the fact you've gone through so much and they've come out the other end stronger and proven your point, I think is a real detriment to you and Belinda. So thank you for everything you've done for the community. And thank you in particular for this show today.
I'm gonna pick you up on it. You said it's a real detriment to the community.
Oh, detriment. Sorry. Well, you said that they never recover, so.
Look, as a closing note, that's fabulous. Thank you for pointing out that I've been a detriment. And